Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject both quietly complex and very poorly understood by modern eyes. We're exploring what intimacy, yes, that kind, was really like in medieval Europe. And trust me, it was a lot less silk sheets and candlelight and a lot more awkward glances, shared rooms, and a constant fear of gossip. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the first big misconception. Many people picture medieval intimacy happening beneath luxurious canopies, accompanied by gentle music and the flicker of dozens of beeswax candles. The truth was far less poetic. For the vast majority of people, peasants, artisans, and anyone below the level of nobility privacy, as we know it, simply did not exist. Most homes were one-room dwellings. That one room housed your entire family. Grandparents, small children, visiting cousins, and occasionally livestock. Goats, chickens, and the occasional piglet provided a curious and highly judgmental audience. Beds, when they existed, were narrow straw mattresses or wooden platforms. These were usually shared by multiple family members. Curtains, those rare and wondrous items, were a luxury few could afford. Even among the upper classes, servants often slept within earshot of their masters. In many noble homes, stewards kept detailed records of sleeping arrangements, partly for religious reasons, partly for property disputes. This created layers of awkward documentation where intimacy became a matter of record as much as of affection. Now you might wonder, how did couples find time for private moments? Very carefully. Timing was everything. So was volume control. Ideally, children would be asleep, and anyone awake would be facing the wall out of politeness, if not genuine disinterest. Inns, those bustling centers of travel, provided even less privacy. The typical medieval inn featured large shared beds. It was entirely possible to find yourself trying to settle in beside a stranger wearing heavy boots, a snoring merchant, or someone's pet ferret. Finding an opportunity for closeness in such a setting required a level of discretion bordering on espionage. For those living under religious vows, such as monks and nuns, the rules were clear, at least on parchment. No, and again, no. No privacy, no distractions, no lingering glances across the cloister. Of course, human nature being what it is, Not every monastery was immune to occasional scandals. Many abbeys responded by constructing ever higher garden walls. And one suspects that not all the gardening done within those walls was strictly horticultural. Above all, the medieval church exerted an enormous influence over intimate life. According to official doctrine, intimacy was for one purpose only procreation. It was not to be enjoyed or used to strengthen marital bonds or employed as a form of stress relief. In fact, many church teachings explicitly discouraged the notion that physical closeness could serve any function other than creating more faithful Christians. Bishops and theologians produced elaborate lists of acceptable and unacceptable practices. The lists covered not just what could happen, but when it was allowed to happen. Entire seasons of the liturgical calendar. Lent, Advent. Numerous saints' feast days were designated as off-limits. Even on normal days, certain days of the week were discouraged. Sunday. Of course not. That was the Lord's Day. Friday. A day of penance. Again, no. Wednesdays, suspicious. Some manuals suggested that perhaps only Tuesdays in April remained truly free from prohibition. Married couples were expected to approach each other with profound modesty. Expressions of affection were permitted, but only sparingly. Displays of passion were heavily frowned upon. One 13th century guide advised couples to proceed with neither pleasure nor delay, which one imagines resulted in many deeply underwhelming evenings. Preferred positions were similarly regulated. The so-called missionary position was deemed the most natural, and therefore the least likely to incur divine displeasure. Other options were considered at best eccentric, at worst deeply sinful. Confession further reinforced these attitudes. Priests were instructed to ask extremely pointed questions about their parishioners' conduct behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. These were not vague inquiries about general morality. The questions were precise, detailed, and likely the cause of many long silences in the confessional booth. Yet enforcement varied. Some regions maintained strict observance of church teachings. Others, particularly rural areas, operated with greater flexibility. Peasants, whose daily concerns centered on survival rather than orthodoxy, often nodded politely to religious instructions and proceeded according to the rhythms of their lives. Still, a misstep could carry consequences. Gossip moved faster than even the worst plague rats. A poorly timed tryst, especially during forbidden periods, could lead to public shame, a visit to the confessor, or a scolding sermon delivered with an unsettling degree of eye contact. Among the nobility, the stakes were even higher. Wealthier households were under greater scrutiny. chaplains and confessors kept close watch, ensuring that marital conduct remained suitably restrained. Among peasants, the concerns were more practical, namely, avoiding additional mouths to feed at inopportune times. In short, the landscape of medieval intimacy was one of caution, calculation, and considerable discomfort. Privacy was scarce. Opportunities were fleeting. The risks, social, spiritual, and sometimes physical, were ever present. And yet, against this backdrop of prohibitions and privations, people found ways, quietly, carefully, and with a persistence that speaks to the enduring human need for connection. And this is only the first stage of our sleepy journey. If you're still awake, let's continue drifting a little deeper into this very complicated and somewhat disappointing world of medieval intimacy. In our first stage, we uncovered the rather dismal state of privacy, or lack thereof, for couples in medieval Europe. Now let's move on to another uniquely exhausting obstacle: the church calendar. Yes, even if you managed to find a quiet moment, an unoccupied bed, and the temporary absence of inquisitive in-laws, you still had to contend with what might be called the sacred scheduling problem. Because in the eyes of the medieval church, intimacy was not merely an act between two married individuals. It was a theological event, one that required strict timing, somber intention, and ideally, very little enthusiasm. To understand the extent of this, we must picture the typical medieval couple trying in good faith to follow church guidance. First, they had to eliminate entire stretches of the year due to major liturgical seasons. Lent, of course, 40 long days of abstinence, prayer, and reflection. Then Advent, another 40 days, leading up to Christmas. That's already roughly 22% of the year accounted for. But that was only the beginning. Sundays were right out, being the Lord's Day. Fridays were a day of penance. Wednesdays, in some areas, were viewed with suspicion as well. Then came the feast days of saints, scattered liberally. Throughout the year, often multiple times per month. Each saint's day brought its own prohibitions, reminders to focus on the spiritual rather than the physical. And then there were fasting days, additional opportunities for reflection and abstention, which again ruled out any personal indulgences. If you kept a careful tally, you would find that well over half the calendar was technically off limits for intimacy, according to the more rigorous interpretations. And these prohibitions were not vague suggestions. They were often written down in detailed manuals for confessors. One 13th century confession guide, for instance, contained lists of forbidden days so extensive that one might wonder if the compiler had some personal interest in discouraging earthly pleasures altogether. Another bishop of the same era scolded a couple for being too affectionate, which in their case meant more than once per month. He suggested they direct their energies toward prayer instead. The couple was reportedly unimpressed with this advice. Yet it was not only the when of intimacy that the church dictated the how was just as important. The preferred method was what we now know as the missionary position, not coincidentally, since it was viewed as the most natural and least spiritually risky. Anything else, and I do mean anything else, was discouraged, if not outright condemned. Enthusiasm itself was suspect. Couples were advised to proceed with modesty and restraint, and to keep in mind the primary, indeed, the only acceptable purpose of intimacy: procreation. Theologians were fond of reminding parishioners that pleasure was not the point. If pleasure occurred, it was to be endured with humility, perhaps followed by confession. This led to a rather joyless checklist for marital relations. No unnecessary touching, no unnecessary words, no smiling, certainly no laughter, and absolutely no improvisation. The spirit of spontaneity was not welcome in the medieval bedroom. Confession played a particularly intrusive role in enforcing these norms. Priests were expected to inquire with great specificity into the conduct of married couples. Were they adhering to the calendar of prohibitions? Were they employing only the approved position? Were they pursuing intimacy with the proper somber mindset? Confession manuals provided priests with sample questions to guide these delicate conversations. And these were not abstract philosophical questions. They were practical, and for the penitent deeply uncomfortable. It is likely that many a medieval confessional was filled with long, awkward silences as parishioners weighed whether to tell the truth or offer a carefully sanitized version of their private lives. Priests themselves varied widely in their approach. Some were zealous enforcers of the rules. Others, particularly in more rural areas, took a more pragmatic stance, understanding that their flock's primary concern was survival, not perfect spiritual discipline. Still, the threat of social shame and spiritual guilt was always present. For the nobility, these restrictions were even more pronounced. Noble households often included personal chaplains and confessors who monitored their charges with great diligence. A noblewoman found to be too affectionate could find herself the subject of stern lectures and religious penance. A nobleman, of course, was more likely to face discreet warnings or polite counseling. Such was the gender imbalance of the time. Among the peasantry, practical concerns usually took precedence. When one's life revolved around livestock harvest cycles and the struggle not to freeze to death in winter, the nuances of saintly calendars often took a back seat. Many peasant couples simply nodded along in church-made token attempts to honor the rules and quietly proceeded with their lives. The local priest might know, might suspect, but often turned a blind eye, particularly if the couple was otherwise devout and paid their tithes on time. And yet, despite this elaborate web of prohibitions, medieval people, like people everywhere, remained people. They found ways to adapt. Secret moments, quiet compromises, a subtle wink here, a whispered word there. For many, love and affection persisted even in the face of calendars that seemed determined to extinguish both. But the risks remained. An ill-timed embrace during Lent might lead to sharp words from the pulpit. An indiscreet comment overheard in the marketplace could result in a visit from the priest. And always the weight of expectation hung heavy. Be fruitful, but be discreet. Be dutiful, but not joyful. Follow the rules, but somehow also sustain a marriage. A delicate balance, to say the least. And this brings us neatly to the next stage of our sleepy exploration. How medieval couples navigated reputation gossip and the ever-present eyes of their neighbors. But that, dear listener, is a story for our next chapter. For now, perhaps take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let your mind drift softly through the flickering candlelight of medieval Europe. We'll continue soon in a world where every glance could spark gossip, and the church dictated when and how married couples could be together. It is perhaps no surprise that the foundation of intimacy in medieval Europe was rarely about romance. It was about economics. Marriage was not primarily an affair of the heart. It was a business transaction, a contract, a careful negotiation between families. Love might emerge later if one was fortunate. If not, well, the harvest still needed gathering, and pigs still needed tending. For most people, the decision to marry had little to do with personal choice. Among the peasantry families, arranged matches with an eye toward land, livestock, and labor. A son might be urged to marry the daughter of a neighboring farmer whose oxen were particularly sturdy. A daughter might be promised to a young man whose family owned a well-placed field or an extra cow. The courtship process, such as it was, typically involved parents speaking to one another before the young couple spoke to each other at all. In some regions, prospective spouses met for the first time on the day of their betrothal, an event attended by both families, local elders, and sometimes the entire village. Dowries were a central concern. A bride's family was expected to provide goods, coin, clothing, livestock, or land to her new household. In return, the groom's family might offer a bride price or gifts to the bride's kin. These exchanges were not tokens of affection, but binding elements of the marriage contract. A larger dowry could elevate a young woman's prospects considerably. A smaller one might limit her options. And for families with many daughters and limited means, the dowry question was a source of constant worry. Among the nobility, these calculations reached dizzying heights. Here, marriage served to cement political alliances, resolve disputes, and expand estates. Negotiations could take years. Entire dynasties hinged on the successful arrangement of a suitable match. It was not uncommon for a noblewoman to be married off in her early teens, sometimes even younger, to a man many years her senior. Her personal wishes were secondary to the interests of her family. Even kings were subject to these forces. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were about treaties, trade agreements, and the delicate balancing of power between rival courts. And yet, amid all this calculation, human feeling still found space to exist, though carefully and often in secret. Courtly love, the idealized, often unconsummated affection, celebrated in troubadour songs, offered an outlet for longing and desire outside the rigid confines of marriage. Noble knights composed verses for unattainable ladies. Noble ladies entertained respectful, if somewhat performative attentions from suitors they could never hope to marry. Of course, real life was rarely as decorous as the poetry suggested. Affairs did occur. So did scandals. But the language of courtly love allowed for the expression of emotion within socially acceptable boundaries, a kind of elegant safety valve for the human heart. Among peasants, expressions of affection were more pragmatic. A young couple might exchange small gifts, a ribbon, a hand-carved token, a loaf of bread. They might steal moments together during communal work or festivals. A walk to the village well could become an opportunity for quiet conversation, a rare moment unobserved. But even here, marriage remained the primary goal. In a harsh and uncertain world, securing a household and producing heirs were pressing concerns. And so marriages preceded some joyful, many simply practical. Love, if it came later. In many cases, affection grew through shared labor and hardship. A couple who planted together, harvested together, survived winter together, and raised children together might over time forge a deep and abiding bond. In others, the match remained one of duty alone. Intimacy was performed as required, without ceremony, without pleasure, and always with one eye on the church calendar. It is worth noting that the church insisted on the concept of consent in marriage, at least in theory. Canon law required that both parties freely agree to the union. In practice, social and familial pressures made refusal difficult, particularly for women. And once married, a wife's obligations were clear. She was expected to submit to her husband's desires within the limits set by religious teaching. A husband, in turn, was expected to provide for his wife and household, though his obligations were more economic than emotional. Marital affection, while encouraged in principle, was not the primary focus. Producing legitimate heirs was. Among the nobility, the pressure to bear children was immense. A noblewoman who failed to provide an heir might face repudiation, or worse. Her status within the household depended heavily on her fertility. For peasant women, the burden was equally heavy, though less politically charged. More children meant more hands for farm work, but also more mouths to feed. In a world where infant mortality was high and maternal health precarious, the risks of repeated childbirth were stark. And yet, amid this relentless focus on duty and survival, moments of genuine tenderness did occur. There are surviving letters from medieval spouses, both noble and humble, that speak of longing affection and deep attachment. Such expressions were all the more precious for being rare. They remind us that even in a society governed by contracts and caution, the simple human need for connection endured. But love marriage and the economics of intimacy were only part of the story. For those seeking to control when and how children were conceived, or hoping to avoid that outcome altogether, an entirely different and often curious set of practices came into play. And that is where we'll turn next, the strange, hopeful, and frequently baffling world of medieval contraception and birth control. For couples in medieval Europe, marriage was expected to result in children, preferably many of them, and preferably quickly. But not everyone shared the Church's enthusiasm for an ever-growing household. Peasant families struggling with limited resources, noble women hoping to preserve their status, or couples simply seeking a little breathing room between births, all had their reasons for wanting to delay or prevent pregnancy. Yet here, as in so many aspects of medieval life, the available tools were rudimentary at best and outright bizarre at worst. Officially, of course, contraception was forbidden. The Church taught that any deliberate attempt to prevent conception was sinful. Intimacy was permitted only within marriage, and only for the purpose of procreation. Anything else invited both spiritual condemnation and social risk. But human nature, persistent as ever, often refused to conform entirely to doctrine. And so, a shadowy world of folk remedies, herbal concoctions, and whispered advice flourished alongside the official teachings. Among the most common approaches were herbal preparations believed to reduce fertility. Midwives and wise women, often repositories of local medical knowledge, passed down recipes involving a bewildering array of plants. Some had mild contraceptive properties. Others were purely symbolic. A few were actively dangerous. One popular method involved drinking wine boiled with crushed beaver testicles. Another recommended wearing amulets containing dried weasel parts. Both were, needless to say, ineffective, except perhaps at discouraging close contact altogether. More promising were certain herbal mixtures. Pennyroyal, for example, was known to have abortifacient properties. Rue and juniper were also used, though, with uncertain results. These herbs were typically consumed as teas or tinctures. The exact recipes varied from village to village, often guarded as secrets, and passed from mother to daughter, or from trusted midwife to client. Effectiveness was inconsistent, and the risks were considerable. Overuse of pennyroyal, for instance, could cause severe liver damage, a detail not always known to the hopeful user. In addition to ingested remedies, medieval people employed a range of barrier methods, or what passed for them. One such method involved inserting linen cloth soaked in vinegar or wine into the vagina before intercourse. The theory was that the acidity would kill sperm. The practice was uncomfortable and only marginally effective. Other accounts mention the use of wax plugs or even hardened mixtures of resin and herbs. The application of these materials required a certain boldness and a disregard for personal comfort. Animal membranes, particularly those of sheep or goats, were sometimes fashioned into primitive sheaths. These devices, while offering some degree of protection, were not widely available, and were associated more with brothels than with respectable marriage beds. Indeed, much of what we know about medieval contraception comes from legal and ecclesiastical records condemning its use among prostitutes. This suggests that in the broader population, such methods were either less common or less openly discussed. There were also ritualistic approaches. Some believed that burying certain objects near the threshold of one's home could ward off conception. Others relied on spoken charms or the wearing of talismans inscribed with arcane symbols. One particularly strange instruction advised women to jump vigorously after intercourse in the hope of dislodging any potential problem. The scientific basis for this practice was, shall we say, optimistic. More elaborate rituals might involve complex timing. Couples were advised to avoid intercourse at certain phases of the moon or during particular hours of the night. Astrological charts were consulted. The alignment of stars and planets was thought to influence fertility, for better or worse. These methods reflected a world view in which the physical and the spiritual were deeply intertwined. If the heavens could shape a harvest or a king's fate, why not one's chances of bearing a child? The Church, unsurprisingly, frowned upon all such practices. Clergy preached regularly against contraception and the use of unnatural remedies. Manuals for confessors instructed priests to question parishioners about such behavior. The penalties could include public penance, exclusion from communion, or more severe ecclesiastical discipline, yet enforcement was inconsistent. In rural areas, where midwives wielded considerable influence and the practicalities of survival often outweighed doctrinal purity, the Church's strictures were not always observed. Among the nobility, matters were more complicated. A noblewoman might seek to space her pregnancies for reasons of health or political calculation. Her household might quietly tolerate the use of certain herbs or methods, provided no scandal resulted. Discretion was paramount, and if a well-placed dowry or a timely gift to the parish priest helped smooth over potential trouble, so much the better. Despite all these efforts, the simple truth remained. Medieval contraception was unreliable. Herbs might reduce fertility, but they did not guarantee it. Barrier methods were primitive and inconsistent. Rituals and charms provided little more than psychological comfort. As a result, many pregnancies occurred despite precautions, and when they did, the consequences varied dramatically, depending on the couple's social standing and marital status. For a married couple, an unexpected child was usually accepted, if not always welcomed, with enthusiasm. Among the poor, each additional mouth to feed strained already limited resources. Among the noble, the politics of inheritance and legitimacy added further layers of complexity. For an unmarried woman, however, pregnancy could spell disaster. The social penalties for bearing a child out of wedlock were severe, a subject we'll explore in detail soon. Yet even in the face of these risks, couples persisted. The desire for intimacy, for connection, for moments of warmth in a harsh and often unforgiving world, these things endured, however imperfectly served by the available methods. And so the strange dance continued, the Church proclaiming midwives, advising couples, calculating, and life unfolding in all its messy unpredictability. But the question remained, when pregnancy did occur, as it often did, how was it managed? What options existed for the woman? How did communities respond to the arrival of an unexpected child? These questions and more await us in the next stage. For couples in medieval Europe, navigating intimacy was a challenge shaped by walls too thin, neighbors too curious, and a church calendar too crowded with prohibitions. Yet perhaps the most delicate obstacle of all awaited them not at home, but in the dim, incense-scented space of the confessional. Here, amid whispered prayers and the faint creak of wooden kneelers, priests became the unlikely custodians of their parishioners' most private acts. confession was not optional. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 had decreed that all Christians must confess their sins to a priest at least once a year. Failure to do so could result in excommunication, a fate both spiritually and socially disastrous. And so, whether they wished to or not, medieval couples found themselves kneeling before a priest, compelled to disclose not only their public failings, but also the most intimate details of their married life. Confession. Manuals from the period leave little doubt as to the thoroughness of this process. Priests were provided with lengthy lists of questions to guide their inquiries. These were not polite, general prompts. They were precise, probing, and occasionally unsettling in their specificity. Had the couple engaged in intimacy on a forbidden day, during Lent, on a saint's feast day, after attending Mass without proper reflection? Had they used any position other than the one deemed proper by the Church? Had they sought pleasure rather than procreation? Had they indulged in excessive affection? One widely circulated manual advised confessors to ask whether couples had experienced undue delight in their relations, a phrase that likely caused many an awkward pause. Another instructed priests to inquire whether the act had been undertaken without sin, without pleasure, and without delay, the ideal being a joyless and efficient process carried out strictly for the purpose of begetting children. The level of detail expected in confession varied by region and by priest. Some clergy approached the task with grim determination, convinced that rooting out every impure thought and act was essential to the salvation of their flock. Others, particularly in rural parishes, where survival often took precedence over strict moral observance, adopted a more lenient stance. These priests might turn a blind eye to minor deviations or encourage general confessions without demanding specifics. But the threat of a zealous confessor was always present. Parishioners knew that a poorly handled confession could result in public penance or even formal charges of moral laxity. And so many couples learned to navigate the confessional with care. Answers were carefully phrased. Details were omitted or softened. The line between honesty and prudence became finely drawn. In some cases, entire strategies emerged. Wives might confess separately from their husbands, each tailoring their account to preserve family harmony and social standing. Husbands, in turn, might feign ignorance or claim forgetfulness, a convenient refuge when faced with uncomfortable questions. Priests, for their part, were not immune to the difficulties of their role. On one hand, they were tasked with enforcing church teaching, upholding the moral standards of their community, and ensuring that their parishioners approached intimacy with appropriate solemnity. On the other hand, they were human beings, often young and inexperienced, confronted with an unending stream of whispered confidences about matters they had no personal experience of. Confession manuals warned priests against becoming overly curious or indulgent in their questioning, a temptation that, judging by the frequency of such warnings, was not entirely rare. The risk of scandal was real. There are records of priests who abused the confessional either to extract favors or to spread gossip. Such cases were harshly punished when discovered, but their very existence added another layer of caution to an already fraught process. And yet, for all its intrusiveness, confession served a vital social function. It provided a controlled outlet for private anxieties. It allowed the Church to reinforce its moral teachings. And it offered parishioners a way to cleanse their consciences, however imperfectly, and return to communal life. Many confessors understood this dual role. The wisest priests balanced doctrinal rigor with pastoral care, recognizing that an overly harsh approach could drive their flock into secrecy and despair. Some even used the confessional to subtly relax the more impractical elements of church teaching. A gentle priest might remind a weary mother that affection within marriage was not a sin, or quietly reassure a guilt-ridden husband that occasional joy was no cause for shame. Such leniency was not officially sanctioned, but it reflected a pragmatic understanding of human nature. The best confessors knew that a faith too rigid would break, while one tempered with compassion might endure. Of course, not all parishioners were equally skilled at navigating the confessional. The young, the naive, and the overly scrupulous often confessed to imagined sins, burdening themselves with guilt over acts that the Church itself did not formally condemn. Manuals advised priests to exercise caution with such penitents, lest their consciences become unduly tormented. Conversely, habitual sinners and practiced deceivers might confess only what they deemed necessary, concealing their true conduct behind pious words and carefully constructed omissions. It was a game of sorts, one in which both priest and penitent participated, each aware of the other's role and limitations. In the end, the confessional was both mirror and mask. It reflected the Church's ideal vision of marital intimacy, controlled, chaste, and purposeful, even as it revealed the messy realities of human desire. Couples emerged from confession cleansed in theory, if not always in practice. The cycle continued: temptation act, guilt, confession, penance, and return to the world, slightly lighter or slightly more burdened, depending on the skill of the priest and the honesty of the penitent. And through it all, the broader forces of reputation, law, and social expectation loomed ever present. For there remained yet another layer of scrutiny: the legal records and public courts, where even the most private failings could become matters of public record, a subject to which we shall turn next. While the confessional offered a relatively private, if uncomfortable, space for disclosing moral failings, not all sins remained cloaked in whispered absolutions. Sometimes, what occurred behind closed doors made its way into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. For medieval couples, the greatest fear was not divine punishment, which might be delayed or uncertain, but the far more immediate prospect of being summoned before a public court. There, their private acts would be transformed into official records open to the judgment of peers, neighbors, and posterity. Throughout medieval Europe, a complex web of ecclesiastical and secular courts existed to enforce moral conduct. The Church's own courts, sometimes called consistory or archdeacons' courts, handled cases of sexual misconduct, marital disputes, and breaches of religious law. These proceedings were not confined to great cities or high-profile scandals. Even the smallest parish might find itself embroiled in the slow, deliberate machinery of ecclesiastical justice. Summonses were issued. Witnesses were called. The accused were required to appear often in their finest clothing, though this did little to soften the humiliation. The records of these cases survive in dusty archives and fading manuscripts, providing a window, albeit a drafty one, into the tangled intersection of law morality and intimacy. What kinds of cases appeared before the courts? The range was broad, though certain offenses occurred with predictable regularity. Adultery was a primary concern. An unfaithful spouse threatened not only the moral fabric of society, but the sanctity of inheritance. For the nobility, a bastard child could derail entire dynastic ambitions. For peasants, it could disrupt fragile family alliances and provoke dangerous feuds. Fornication. Sexual relations outside of marriage also drew the Church's ire. Young couples caught in moments of weakness were often hauled before the court, their conduct laid bare in excruciating detail. More curious were cases involving improper behavior within marriage itself. A husband accused of undue violence, a wife suspected of using herbal contraceptives, a couple rumored to engage in unsanctioned acts, all might find themselves facing formal proceedings. And then there were the cases of pre-contract promises of marriage exchanged in moments of passion, later denied or disputed. Such cases could drag on for years, their resolution depending less on theological principle and more on the persuasive power of witnesses. The process of a typical ecclesiastical court case was in theory orderly and just. In practice, it was often slow, expensive, and deeply uncomfortable. The first step was accusation. Sometimes this arose from an offended spouse or parent. Other times, it emerged from the ever-vigilant eyes of the community. Gossip might be dismissed as idle talk unless it persisted. In such cases, church officials were duty-bound to investigate. A formal inquiry would be launched, and if sufficient evidence emerged, the accused would be summoned to appear. Witness testimony played a central role. Here the peculiarities of medieval life became apparent. A servant claiming to have overheard nocturnal noises, a neighbor reporting suspicious visits, a child innocently repeating overheard fragments of adult conversation. The line between evidence and hearsay was thin, and once a case reached the court discretion, became impossible. The proceedings themselves were both ritualized and invasive. The accused were required to swear oaths of truthfulness, though the temptation to prevaricate was strong. Witnesses were questioned in detail, sometimes cruelly so. The public nature of these hearings ensured that every misstep became part of the community's collective memory. Penalties varied according to the severity of the offense and the social standing of the accused. Fines were common. A prosperous merchant might be required to pay a substantial sum to the church or to the injured party. Public penance was another favored punishment. The offender might be ordered to stand barefoot before the congregation, clad in a simple shift, holding a candle, while the priest delivered a sermon on the perils of sin. In extreme cases, excommunication could be imposed, a devastating penalty that severed the individual from both spiritual and social life. It is worth noting that the records of these cases, preserved with bureaucratic diligence, now form one of our richest sources for understanding medieval sexuality. Through them, we glimpse not only the letter of church law, but the messy realities of human behavior. We see young couples pleading for mercy, claiming their affection was genuine and their intentions honorable. We see betrayed spouses demanding redress, not always from a place of piety, but often from wounded pride or practical concern. We see servants navigating the dangerous territory of testimony, knowing that a poorly timed word could cost them their livelihood. And beneath it all, we sense the quiet persistence of human desire, stubbornly refusing to conform to the strict lines drawn by law and doctrine. Of course, ecclesiastical courts were not the only venue for such matters. Secular courts also addressed cases of sexual misconduct, particularly when violence or property was involved. Rape, though notoriously difficult to prosecute, did appear in legal records. So did cases of seduction, abduction, and disputes over dowry payments linked to broken promises of marriage. The procedures here were even more public, the penalties often harsher. A man convicted of violating a noblewoman might face mutilation or death. A peasant woman might receive little justice at all, depending on the sympathies of the court. And in all these cases, The same grim pattern, repeated private acts, transformed into public spectacle, preserved forever in the annals of medieval bureaucracy. Yet for all the seriousness of these proceedings, life and love went on. The courts could punish the church, could admonish, but they could not extinguish the deep, enduring impulse toward connection. Couples continued to meet in secret. Affections blossomed amid the constraints of duty and doctrine, and human ingenuity, as always, found ways to navigate the labyrinth of law and custom. But the Church, ever vigilant, devised yet another layer of control, a detailed moral calendar designed to govern not only when couples might be together, but how often and under what conditions. That, of course, is where we shall turn next. In the intricate dance of medieval intimacy, official rules, whether proclaimed from the pulpit or inscribed in dusty canon law, were only part of the story. Equally powerful, and in many cases more immediate, was the pervasive force of community surveillance. For most people, life unfolded in full view of their neighbors. And those neighbors, it must be said, possessed a well-honed talent for observing and commenting upon one another's affairs. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a rare and precious commodity in medieval Europe. Peasant homes were small and often shared with extended family members. Space was at a premium. Walls, when present, were thin, and windows, when open, invited both fresh air and curious glances. Even among the nobility households were filled with servants, retainers, and assorted dependents. The noble bedchamber, far from being a sanctuary, was often the site of comings and goings by those whose duties or ambitions kept them close to their lord or lady. In such an environment, the boundary between public and private life was porous at best. The Church, ever attentive to the moral well-being of its flock, encouraged this state of affairs. Sermons extolled the virtue of watchfulness. Parishioners were reminded of their duty to uphold communal standards. And while the language was framed in terms of mutual care, the practical result was a culture of sanctioned nosiness. A suspicious glance, a whispered comment, a knowing nod, such gestures could travel swiftly through the social web of a village or town. And once a rumor had taken root, dislodging it proved exceedingly difficult. Common sources of suspicion were many and varied. A young woman, seen lingering too long in conversation with a particular man. A wife observed walking alone at dusk. A servant reporting that a master or mistress had summoned someone to their chambers after the household had retired. Even the simple rearrangement of domestic space could provoke comment. Curtains drawn at unusual hours, a bed shifted closer to the hearth, the absence of familiar sounds or the presence of unfamiliar ones. Children, ever eager to repeat what they overheard, provided a steady stream of unfiltered intelligence. And neighbors accustomed to the rhythms of one another's lives noticed small deviations with remarkable acuity. Once suspicion began to circulate, it could escalate quickly. Initial whispers might be exchanged at the well or during market day. From there, the matter might reach the ears of the parish priest or a local magistrate. In some cases, formal complaints were lodged. In others, the accused found themselves the subject of quiet social sanctions, invitations, withheld greetings, curtailed goods sold at inflated prices. The weight of communal disapproval could be crushing, particularly for women, whose reputations were far more fragile and more closely tied to family honor. A single accusation, even if unfounded, could shadow a young woman's prospects for marriage. A married woman, found to be too friendly with a neighbor, might face coldness not only from her peers, but from her own household. And for men, while the consequences were often less severe, public shame still carried a sting. A cuckolded husband became a subject of ridicule. A man known for pursuing married women might find his social standing subtly eroded. The machinery of shame extended beyond mere gossip. Certain forms of public penance were explicitly designed to reinforce communal norms. A woman caught in adultery might be required to process through the village barefoot, dressed in a plain shift, carrying a candle or a symbolic object of her sin. A man convicted of fornication could be ordered to stand in the church porch for a series of Sundays, exposed to the gaze of his fellow parishioners. Such rituals served a dual purpose: to expiate the sin and to deter others from similar transgressions. Whether they succeeded in the latter goal is difficult to say. Human nature, after all, remained stubbornly resistant to public instruction. Even absent formal punishment, the fear of exposure shaped behavior. Couples learned to be cautious. Meetings were arranged in out-of-the-way places, in woods near wells, or during the rare moments when the household was otherwise occupied. Messages were conveyed through trusted intermediaries. Tokens of affection were small and concealable. Conversations were guarded with affectionate words, reserved for moments when no ears were presumed to be listening. Yet these precautions could not always shield against the vigilance of the community. A scorned suitor, a jealous rival, or a disgruntled servant could undo months of careful discretion with a single well-placed word. The burden of surveillance also weighed heavily on midwives and healers. Women suspected of providing contraceptive herbs or facilitating clandestine relationships were prime targets for communal suspicion. A midwife whose services were too frequently required outside the bounds of marriage might find herself accused of moral laxity, or worse, of witchcraft. The fine line between healer and heretic was perilously thin, and many wise women walked it with weary caution. In noble circles, surveillance was even more deliberate. Courtiers employed spies and informants to monitor the behavior of rivals. Ladies of high birth were chaperoned with near constant vigilance, their conduct recorded and reported with tireless precision. Yet here, too, discretion found its champions. A trusted maidservant could be worth her weight in gold, or at least in silver, for her ability to avert suspicion and manage delicate arrangements. And as with the peasantry, the tension between public virtue and private desire played out in an endless, if often wearying cycle. Through it all, the ordinary human longing for affection and connection persisted. Couples learned to navigate the gaze of the community with ingenuity and resilience. And in doing so, they preserved a measure of agency within the tightly woven fabric of medieval life. But their efforts were not always enough. When surveillance failed and shame proved insufficient, some turned to more extreme measures, secret spaces, and coded communications that allowed them to defy the watchful eyes around them. That, of course, is where we shall turn next. In a world where intimacy was hemmed in on every side by church doctrine, by communal surveillance, by the moral calendar, and the prying ears of neighbors, it is perhaps no surprise that certain spaces emerged where the usual rules were adjusted. The medieval brothel occupied a curious place in this landscape. Officially condemned, frequently tolerated, and occasionally regulated, it represented a pragmatic concession to human nature, acknowledged even by those who spent their Sundays denouncing it from the pulpit. Indeed, the very existence of brothels within the tightly woven moral fabric of medieval Europe tells us something important about the balance, or lack thereof, between ideal and reality. Let us begin with the matter of legality. Brothels were not universally legal, nor were they universally illegal. Their status varied from place to place, and even from decade to decade, depending on the prevailing mood of civic and ecclesiastical authorities. In many medieval towns, particularly those engaged in significant trade brothels, were licensed and taxed by municipal governments. The rationale was pragmatic. By concentrating such activities in designated locations, and ideally under some degree of supervision, officials hoped to prevent more disruptive forms of sexual misconduct. A regulated brothel, so the thinking went, was preferable to unchecked adultery, seduction of respectable maidens, or the corruption of apprentices and servants. Whether this reasoning held true in practice is a question that medieval magistrates, much like their modern counterparts, likely debated endlessly and without clear resolution. Brothels themselves varied in size and character. In large cities, they might occupy substantial buildings with multiple rooms and a staff of workers, attendants, and managers. In smaller towns, a brothel might consist of little more than a single house maintained by a madam and a handful of women. Their outward appearance was often unremarkable. Unlike the brightly lit establishments of later eras, medieval brothels were generally discreet, though not so discreet as to prevent regular custom. Certain streets or quarters became known for such establishments. In London, for example, Southwark, across the river from the city proper, housed numerous brothels operating under the somewhat uneasy oversight of both church and civic authorities. The women who worked in brothels came from varied and often difficult circumstances. Some entered the profession by choice, or what passed for choice under the economic constraints of the time. Widows without family support young women displaced by war or famine, and those escaping unhappy marriages sometimes found in brothel work a means of survival. Others were coerced or trafficked, their labor secured through debt deception or outright force. In port cities, where ships brought both wealth and social dislocation, the number of such women was often higher. Municipal authorities, for their part, oscillated between efforts to regulate brothel work and moral campaigns to eradicate it. The former approach generally prevailed, though not without periodic attempts at reform, usually prompted by outbreaks of disease or scandal involving persons of influence. Brothel workers occupied an ambiguous social space. They were neither entirely ostracized nor fully accepted. While church teaching condemned their profession, many priests and monks with varying degrees of self-awareness were among their clientele. Merchants, artisans, and even members of the nobility frequented brothels, often under cover of night or with the tacit connivance of household servants. Public tolerance waxed and waned. During periods of strict religious fervor, brothel workers might be driven from the city or subjected to humiliating public penance. Yet in quieter times, their presence was accepted as an unfortunate but necessary part of urban life, much like open sewers or poorly maintained streets. Inside the brothel, daily life followed a rhythm shaped by necessity and opportunity. Workers typically paid a portion of their earnings to the madam or manager, who in turn paid taxes or bribes to local officials. Some brothels maintained informal agreements with the church, contributing funds for charitable purposes or the upkeep of local chapels. Whether such arrangements eased the consciences of the parties involved is left to speculation. Clients ranged widely in social status. Young apprentices sought experience. Traveling merchants sought diversion. Aging nobles sought discretion. The currency of payment was equally varied coin goods, or in times of scarcity, food and fuel. Efforts to enforce hygiene and order within brothels were inconsistent. Some municipalities required periodic health inspections carried out by designated physicians or midwives. Records from these inspections survive in some cities, providing a rare glimpse into the conditions of medieval brothel life. Cleanliness standards, where enforced, were rudimentary. Soap was expensive. Bedding was not always changed between clients. Diseases spread readily, though contemporary understanding of their causes remained fragmentary at best. Efforts to improve conditions often lagged behind the more immediate priorities of profit and discretion. Brothels also served as hubs of social information. Clients shared news gossip and plans, some of which found their way back to civic authorities via well-placed informants. Thus, a shrewd brothel keeper might cultivate relationships with both sides of the moral equation, satisfying clients on one hand, providing useful intelligence to officials on the other. In this way, the brothel became not merely a site of illicit commerce, but a node within the broader network of urban life. Yet for all their apparent pragmatism, brothels remained deeply entwined with the moral anxieties of the age. Their existence underscored the persistent gap between the Church's vision of human conduct and the realities of human behavior. They offered refuge to the desperate opportunity to the unscrupulous and temptation to the pious, all within the same dimly lit walls. And as such, they remained a focus of both fascination and condemnation, their fortunes rising and falling with the moral tides of medieval society. Even so, not all intimacy within medieval Europe was so transactional. Courtship, however constrained, did occur. Love, though often overshadowed by duty and doctrine, found ways to flourish. And it is to the curious world of medieval courtship that we shall turn next. As medieval couples navigated the winding path of marital duty, they soon encountered a practical concern: how to manage the size of their families in a world where each new child brought joy and strain. The Church, ever vigilant, held a firm position. Procreation was the primary purpose of marriage, and any attempt to prevent it was sinful. Yet the realities of life often pushed against this ideal. Peasant households, already stretched thin by seasonal uncertainties, and poor harvests struggled to feed large families. Townsfolk faced the rising costs of urban life. Even nobles, mindful of inheritance and property divisions, sometimes sought to space their children, discreetly, of course. And so quietly, a parallel world of birth control advice, folklore, and makeshift remedies persisted beneath the official moral surface. Let us begin with the most basic and least reliable method timing. Medieval people understood in a broad and imperfect way that conception was more likely at certain times. The details, however, were the stuff of guesswork and local lore. Some believed that intimacy during certain phases of the moon was more or less likely to result in pregnancy. Others counseled avoiding relations during particularly fertile seasons. Spring, for example, was viewed by some as a time of heightened vitality. Couples who lacked access to more tangible methods might simply attempt to space their relations accordingly, relying on rhythm caution, and one imagines a fair degree of hope. Beyond timing, a variety of physical and herbal methods were employed with varying degrees of plausibility. Certain herbs were known or believed to have contraceptive or abortifacient properties. Pennyroyal rue and Queen Anne's lace were among the most commonly cited. Women might drink infusions made from these plants or use them as pessaries. The precise recipes were often passed down through oral tradition, shared discreetly among women, or taught by midwives. Such knowledge was precarious subject to the distortions of memory and the suspicions of the Church. Indeed, midwives and healers who were known to possess such knowledge sometimes faced accusations of witchcraft or moral corruption. Still, for many women, these remedies represented one of the few available means of agency over their reproductive lives. Other methods were more mechanical in nature, though equally uncertain. Some couples employed barrier methods, cloth soaked in herbal solutions, animal membranes, or wax-based devices. The effectiveness of such measures was at best limited. One might note, however, that the ingenuity of medieval people in adapting everyday materials to this purpose speaks to the persistence of human resourcefulness in the face of moral restriction. Even certain amulets and charms were pressed into service. An amulet inscribed with protective words or symbols might be worn around the waist or neck. The logic here was less about direct physical intervention and more about invoking spiritual protection or favorable fortune. Whether such charms offered real efficacy is doubtful, though they may well have provided a measure of psychological comfort. More colorful methods also circulated through medieval folklore. One persistent belief held that jumping vigorously after intercourse might dislodge potential conception. Another advised tying certain knots in clothing or in a belt, a practice with deep symbolic resonance, if not biological plausibility. Still others swore by the power of particular stones, worn close to the body to prevent pregnancy. The stone agate, for example, was prized in some regions for this purpose. Such beliefs reveal the deep intertwining of magical thinking and bodily knowledge in medieval life. In an era with limited scientific understanding, the boundary between effective medicine and hopeful superstition was necessarily porous. The Church, as might be expected, opposed all such efforts. Official teaching condemned contraception in any form, whether mechanical, herbal, or behavioral. Clerical writings warned that such acts offended both God and the natural order. Confessors were instructed to question parishioners about their reproductive intentions and to impose penance on those who admitted to preventing conception. Yet enforcement was uneven. In rural areas, where priests were often overworked and undertrained, local practices persisted with relative impunity. Even in towns, the privacy of the household shielded many couples from scrutiny. Moreover, the practical needs of the laity sometimes softened clerical rigidity. A priest who heard the confessions of struggling peasants might turn a blind eye to quiet attempts at limiting family size, particularly when faced with the harsh realities of poverty and famine. Among the nobility, matters were somewhat different. While noble families generally sought to produce heirs, they also faced delicate questions of inheritance and alliance. A noblewoman who produced too many children risked diminishing the family's estate through excessive dowries and inheritance claims. Moreover, the physical toll of repeated childbirth was substantial, particularly in an age when maternal mortality remained high. Discreet efforts to space births were therefore not uncommon. In such circles, herbal remedies and mechanical methods were quietly employed, often under the guidance of trusted midwives or court physicians. The risks of exposure were considerable. A noblewoman suspected of using contraception might face not only moral condemnation, but political repercussions, particularly if male heirs were at stake. And yet, as the persistence of such practices suggests, many were willing to take the risk. It is worth noting that not all medieval thinkers were entirely opposed to limiting births. Some secular physicians, writing in the later Middle Ages, acknowledged the dangers of too frequent childbearing and the strain it placed on women's health. A few even offered cautious advice on spacing pregnancies, advice typically framed in terms of safeguarding maternal well-being rather than challenging procreative norms. Such voices were rare, however, and always couched in language acceptable to church doctrine. Publicly advocating contraception as a positive good remained beyond the pale of respectable discourse, and so medieval couples seeking to manage their family size did so quietly, with a blend of folklore, fragile remedies, and practical caution. The results were inconsistent, the knowledge fragmented, and the moral stakes ever present. Yet their efforts testify to a fundamental truth that human beings, even when bound by the strictest codes of faith and custom, will seek ways to shape their own lives. Still, not all couples adhered to the prescribed path of marital intimacy. For some love or desire led beyond the bounds of marriage into the treacherous terrain of adultery. For all the Church's exhortations about the sanctity of marriage, and despite the many practical efforts to manage family size within its bounds, not all medieval desires remained safely confined to the marital bed. The pull of affection or passion or simple human frailty often led individuals, both highborn and humble, into the dangerous waters of adultery. There, the risks were many, the consequences severe, and the methods of detection surprisingly varied. It was a perilous pursuit undertaken at great personal cost, and yet, as the records of church courts, civic tribunals, and chroniclers alike attest, one that persisted across the centuries with undiminished stubbornness. Let us begin, as one must, with the definition of the offense. Adultery in medieval Europe was not merely a private failing. It was a public offense against the sacrament of marriage, the stability of family lineage, and the moral fabric of the community. More precisely, it was defined as sexual relations between a married person and someone not their spouse. For a married woman, the act was always considered adultery. For a married man, the judgment was somewhat more flexible. Relations with a single woman might be viewed as fornication rather than adultery, though not without moral censure. The double standard was both clear and codified. A wife's adultery threatened the certainty of inheritance and the honor of her husband. A husband's dalliances, while regrettable, were less likely to produce such complications. Or so the prevailing logic ran. Detection of adultery relied less on evidence than on suspicion. Few cases involved clear proof. Rather, the community's collective gaze, that ever-watchful force, provided the first warning signs. A woman seen conversing too freely with a man not her husband. An unfamiliar cloak found beneath a window. A door bolted at an unusual hour. Servants, children, and neighbors provided a steady stream of gossip, which might, if sufficiently persistent, reach the ears of local clergy or magistrates. In noble households, rival courtiers or ambitious relatives could weaponize such rumors to advance their own positions. Among peasants, a cuckolded husband might seek public redress to reclaim his honor, or failing that, to ensure the offending parties were at least properly shamed. When formal accusations were made, proceedings varied. In ecclesiastical courts, the burden of proof lay with the accuser, though circumstantial evidence and witness testimony often sufficed. Confession, whether voluntary or extracted under pressure, was the surest path to conviction. In secular courts, particularly in Northern Europe, the process could be more theatrical. Public humiliation, ritual penance, or financial penalties were common outcomes. For women, the consequences were particularly harsh. A wife found guilty of adultery might lose her dowry, be expelled from her household, or face public whipping or shaming. In extreme cases, particularly where noble families were involved, imprisonment or discreet exile was arranged to contain the scandal. Men faced fewer penalties, though certain jurisdictions imposed fines or required public acts of contrition. A husband discovered in flagrante with another man's wife risked not only legal sanction, but the violent wrath of the aggrieved spouse, an outcome that could prove fatal in a society where honor and personal vengeance often outpaced formal justice. Punishments, too, served a performative purpose. The public shaming of adulterers reinforced communal norms, warning others of the costs of straying. A convicted woman might be paraded through the streets clad in a rough shift, bearing a placard that proclaimed her offense. A man might be forced to stand at the church door barefoot and penitent as his neighbors filed past. Such rituals were as much about restoring the community's moral equilibrium as about punishing the individuals involved. Yet one suspects that in many cases they merely drove the behavior further underground. It must be said, however, that not all accusations were just. Jealous rivals, disgruntled spouses, or ambitious family members sometimes manufactured claims of adultery to achieve their own ends. Women in particular were vulnerable to such accusations, which could be ruinous, even if disproven. A woman's reputation was fragile. Once tainted by suspicion, it was difficult to restore. Men, though more insulated, could also suffer if accusations intersected with political rivalries or inheritance disputes. Thus, the charge of adultery became a potent weapon, one whose very threat could shape behavior and constrain personal relationships. And yet, despite the risks, adultery persisted. Some sought passion where their arranged marriages offered none. Others pursued love across forbidden boundaries of class or kinship. Still others acted from impulse resentment or sheer folly. The human heart, after all, rarely consults canon law before leaping. Indeed, the literary record of the period, from courtly romances to ribald tales, is filled with stories of illicit love. Some end in tragedy, others in cautionary humor, but all reflect a reality that no amount of surveillance or shaming could entirely suppress. One might wonder, how did adulterous couples navigate such a perilous landscape? The answer lies in the same arts of secrecy and discretion we have already glimpsed. Secret messages, carefully chosen meeting places, trusted intermediaries. These became essential tools. So too did the cultivation of plausible deniability. A woman might arrange to meet a lover during a public event, ensuring the presence of others to shield her actions. a man might use the cover of a hunting party or pilgrimage to facilitate clandestine encounters. And always the risk remained, for the walls had ears, and the community's memory was long. Yet in contemplating this tangled web of risk punishment and persistent desire, one sees clearly the enduring tension at the heart of medieval sexual life. The ideal of faithful, chaste, and dutiful marital intimacy was proclaimed with relentless fervor. The reality of complex, frail, and longing human hearts unfolded beneath it in countless ways, both hidden and exposed. And so the dance continued, desire pursued, discovered, punished, and pursued again. Still, not all forms of forbidden love fit neatly into the category of adultery. Some, even more perilous and more fiercely condemned, involved attractions that defied not only marital bonds, but the very gender expectations of the age. For all the medieval church's fervent teachings about marital fidelity and the perils of adultery, there remained other desires that fit neither neatly into the sacrament of marriage, nor the usual categories of moral offense. Same-sex attraction, while rarely discussed openly, was not unknown in medieval Europe. It existed quietly, stubbornly, amid a culture that largely refused to acknowledge it, except when seeking to condemn it. The Church taught that such acts were gravely sinful, lumped together with other so-called unnatural behaviors. Civic authorities, when they addressed the matter at all, often prescribed severe penalties. And yet, as with so many other human inclinations, desire did not vanish at the wave of a theological wand. It persisted sometimes in coded forms, sometimes in secret acts, sometimes in relationships that hovered just this side of discovery. To understand the place of same-sex love in medieval life, one must first understand the medieval conception of sexuality. Unlike modern categories of identity, which speak of orientation or personal identity, medieval thought focused on acts. One did not identify as gay or lesbian in any modern sense. Rather, one committed sinful acts or refrained from them according to the moral code of the day. The idea of a stable personal identity based on one's desires was foreign to most medieval thinkers. This conceptual gap both concealed and exposed same-sex relationships. It allowed many forms of deep emotional attachment between persons of the same sex to flourish under the guise of friendship or spiritual companionship. At the same time, it left those whose affections led to physical expression vulnerable to the harshest condemnation. Friendship, particularly among men, was highly valued and openly celebrated in medieval culture. Knights pledged loyalty to one another. Monks formed close bonds of affection. Noblemen wrote letters to their male friends filled with expressions of love and devotion. Such relationships, when conducted within the bounds of platonic affection, were considered virtuous, even saintly. The trouble, of course, lay in determining where platonic affection ended and physical desire began. Church officials were deeply suspicious of close relationships that appeared too intense or too exclusive. Ecclesiastical writings warned against monks who spent too much time together, or who expressed affection in ways that might tempt them to sin. Among the laity public displays of male affection embracing kissing on the cheek were common and culturally accepted. But when such relationships crossed into the realm of sexual activity, the penalties could be swift and severe. Women's same-sex relationships were even more hidden, though not entirely absent from the record. Convent life offered opportunities for intense female companionship. Letters between nuns sometimes express deep longing and affection. Whether these reflected spiritual bonds, romantic feeling, or more is difficult to say. Male chroniclers, for their part, often ignored female same-sex love unless writing scandalously about heresy or witchcraft. Even church law, while explicit in its condemnation of male-male acts, was less precise about female same-sex intimacy, a silence that some women undoubtedly exploited to their advantage. Still, in cases where such relationships became known, they too faced harsh penalties. Official punishments for same-sex acts varied by time and place. In some regions, the penalty was death by burning, hanging, or other grim means. In others, public penance, exile, or imprisonment sufficed. Such punishments were not always evenly applied. A peasant caught in such acts might escape with a fine if the local community was lenient. A nobleman, particularly one entangled in court politics, might face exposure and ruin, or conversely protection from powerful patrons. Clergy caught in such scandals faced not only personal disgrace, but deep institutional shame. Indeed, monastic visitations and episcopal inquiries frequently recorded concerns about sinful familiarity among monks, a euphemism for relationships deemed inappropriate. Despite the dangers same-sex love persisted, it adapted itself to the available social forms. Monastic friendships, knightly brotherhoods, spiritual companionships all provided cover for relationships that might in private become more than platonic. In the secular world, friendships between women, intense and affectionate, were often overlooked unless they provoked open scandal. Even the world of poetry and literature reflected these hidden currents. Certain troubadour songs, though ostensibly about unattainable heterosexual love, contain layers of meaning that modern scholars suggest may reflect same-sex longing. Likewise, certain devotional texts filled with language of divine love and union were interpreted by some medieval readers in ways that blurred spiritual and romantic affection. Navigating such relationships required subtlety. Letters were carefully worded. Expressions of affection, couched in language of friendship or spiritual kinship. Meetings were arranged under the guise of religious observance or shared labor. Trusted servants or fellow monks and nuns might serve as discreet allies or dangerous informants. Above all, discretion was paramount. A careless word, an imprudent gesture, a letter misplaced, any of these could trigger suspicion and ruin. Thus, those who loved beyond the bounds of the accepted order became masters of secrecy. Their lives a quiet testament to the resilience of desire in the face of relentless scrutiny. It is tempting to imagine that such hidden lives were wholly grim or joyless. Yet the surviving fragments suggest otherwise. Even amid fear and constraint, there were moments of happiness, stolen hours of companionship, words exchanged beneath the cover of ritual letters that conveyed longing and love across impossible distances. These relationships, however, fragile, wove a quiet counter-narrative through the grand tapestry of medieval sexual life. They remind us that the human heart, so often instructed to love in one way only, has always found more varied paths than law or doctrine would allow. Still, not all same-sex love remained safely hidden. When relationships were exposed, they could provoke not only individual punishment, but broader waves of fear and repression. Accusations of sodomy in particular became tools of political maneuvering and moral panic, a dark current that would shape the treatment of same-sex love well into the modern era. As we have seen, same-sex love in medieval Europe persisted in hidden corners, in the letters of monks, the friendships of knights, the bonds of nuns, and the quiet moments that defied both law and doctrine. But the line between tolerance and persecution was thin. When such relationships came to light, whether through carelessness, betrayal, or political intrigue, the response could be swift, public, and brutal. Indeed, few accusations in medieval Europe carried more weight or more danger than that of sodomy. The term itself was broad and imprecise, encompassing a wide range of sexual acts deemed unnatural by the Church. But in practice, it was often deployed with particular force against men suspected of same-sex relations. The very word invoked not just personal sin, but civic corruption, divine wrath, and the specter of moral collapse. The roots of this harsh response lay unsurprisingly in church teaching. Medieval theologians viewed same-sex acts as among the gravest of sins, offenses not only against nature, but against God's intended order. Saint Augustine, Saint Jerome, and other influential writers poured out stern warnings on the subject, linking sodomy with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Such teachings shaped canon law, which prescribed severe penances for those convicted of such acts. Over time, secular authorities adopted and amplified this stance, turning moral condemnation into criminal prosecution. By the 13th century, sodomy was a capital offense in many parts of Europe, punishable by death, often by burning. Yet the legal machinery for detecting and prosecuting such cases was inconsistent and subject to many influences beyond simple moral concern. Political motives played a large role. Accusations of sodomy became a potent tool for discrediting rivals, especially in the volatile courts of medieval Europe. A powerful noble, a troublesome bishop, or an unpopular official might suddenly find himself accused of sodomy, the charge serving not only to destroy his reputation, but to justify his removal from office, or worse. Even kings were not immune. Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, famously leveraged such accusations against the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Facing royal debt and eager to dismantle the powerful order, Philip accused the Templars of heresy and sodomy, among other charges. Many knights were tortured, forced to confess, and executed a grim example of how accusations of sexual sin could serve larger political ends. At the local level, accusations often arose from more mundane sources. A spurned lover, a jealous rival, or a nosy neighbor might bring suspicions to the attention of the church or secular authorities. In some cases, investigations were prompted by confessions obtained under duress or during broader inquisitorial campaigns. Once a formal accusation was made, the process was chilling. Suspects were interrogated often with the threat or use of torture. Witnesses, whose testimony might be motivated by fear, envy, or sheer imagination, were called to describe the accused's supposed acts and character. Private letters, clothing, and personal relationships were scrutinized for evidence of sin. And because same-sex acts by their nature left little physical trace, the line between suspicion and conviction was perilously thin. Punishments varied by region and by the social status of the accused. Commoners convicted of sodomy might be hanged or burned, their deaths serving as public warnings. Nobles, if convicted, could face exile imprisonment or public disgrace, though powerful families often intervened to mitigate such outcomes. Clergy faced deposition imprisonment or penance, with public exposure adding to the severity of their fall. The spectacle of such punishments was part of the point. By making an example of the accused, authorities sought to reinforce communal norms and stave off what they framed as moral contagion. Of course, these public rituals of punishment also served another, less acknowledged purpose: to reassure the watching crowd of their own supposed virtue at the expense of those condemned. Not every accusation led to such dire outcomes. In some cases, the accused fled before trial or secured protection through powerful allies. In others, confessions were retracted or witnesses recanted. And in many cases, suspicion alone was enough to destroy a reputation regardless of legal outcome. A man whispered to be a sodomite might find himself shunned, his business ruined, his household dismissed. The social penalties were as enduring and as corrosive as the legal ones. It must be said that not all regions of Europe pursued sodomy prosecutions with equal zeal. In parts of Italy, for example, records suggest a surprisingly high tolerance for same-sex relationships, though this tolerance was often pragmatic rather than principled. Florence, in particular, maintained a complex relationship with such matters. While periodic crackdowns occurred often, prompted by church pressure, the city's vibrant cultural life and shifting politics created space, however precarious, for same-sex love. Indeed, the very frequency of sodomy prosecutions in Florence suggests not a lack of same-sex activity, but rather its relative visibility and endurance despite official condemnation. Such pockets of tolerance, however, were exceptions. For most medieval Europeans, accusations of sodomy evoked deep fear, both of divine punishment and of social ruin, and the language of such accusations carried forward long after the Middle Ages ended, shaping the treatment of same-sex love for centuries to come. Even today, echoes of these medieval anxieties linger in modern laws, prejudices, and debates. They remind us that the persecution of desire and the resilience of those who love, despite it, is a story with deep roots. Yet even as the forces of condemnation gathered against them, some medieval couples sought a different path, the path of secret unions and informal vows. For those who could not or would not marry within the Church's strict framework, whether because of class barriers, prior commitments, or forbidden love, clandestine relationships offered a fragile but precious refuge. While medieval Europe officially prized marriage as a sacred and orderly union, the reality of love was as ever less tidy. Between the arranged alliances of the nobility, the practical marriages of peasants, and the watchful gaze of church and community, there remained little sanctioned space for love that did not fit prescribed patterns. And yet, love persisted. For those whose affection defied social expectation or legal structure for lovers separated by class, for those already bound by other commitments, for same-sex couples, and for those simply unwilling to submit to the Church's strictures, secret unions, and informal vows provided a fragile, imperfect refuge. Not officially sanctioned, not legally binding, but real enough to those who shared them. Let us begin with the most common form, clandestine marriage. Church law required that marriage be celebrated publicly with banns read in church to allow for objections and vows exchanged before a priest. But the essence of marriage, according to canon law, rested on mutual consent. If a man and woman exchanged vows to marry each other in the present tense before witnesses, even without a priest, the marriage was in the eyes of the church valid and indissoluble. This loophole created fertile ground for clandestine unions. Couples seeking to marry without parental approval or without the delays of public ceremony might simply declare themselves wed, sometimes in a field or before a sympathetic friend or in the privacy of a home. Such marriages carried considerable risk. Without official recognition, they were vulnerable to challenge. If one party later denied the union, the other faced a difficult battle to prove its validity. And should the union come to light without prior church sanction, both parties faced ecclesiastical penalties. Still, the allure of clandestine marriage was strong, particularly for young couples whose families opposed their match. Records from ecclesiastical courts are filled with cases involving disputed clandestine unions. A young woman, pregnant and abandoned, might sue to have her union recognized. A parent seeking to break an unwelcome match might argue that no true marriage had occurred. In these cases, witnesses were crucial. Friends or servants who had overheard vows or seen the couple exchange tokens might be called to testify. The content of the vows was dissected with great care. Was the consent given in the present tense or merely promised for the future? Such legal hair-splitting determined whether a relationship became a legitimate marriage or an actionable sin. Beyond clandestine marriage, other forms of informal union existed, less recognized, yet equally real to those involved. Among peasants, cohabitation without formal marriage was not unknown, though it attracted censure. A couple who lived together openly might eventually achieve de facto recognition as husband and wife, particularly if they had children. In some regions, customary law treated long-term cohabitation as equivalent to marriage, a practical concession to the realities of rural life. Still, the church frowned on such arrangements, urging couples to regularize their unions through proper ceremony. The threat of public penance, fines, or exclusion from the sacraments was a powerful incentive, though not always sufficient to overcome economic or personal obstacles. For same-sex couples and other forbidden relationships, more private forms of union emerged. These were not marriages in any legal or ecclesiastical sense, but rather personal vows, sometimes exchanged in secret ceremonies, sometimes marked by the sharing of tokens, rings, or keepsakes. Among monks and nuns, spiritual brotherhoods and sisterhoods provided a socially acceptable framework for intense same-sex friendships, though the boundary between platonic and romantic affection was, as we have seen, often porous. In some cases, such relationships included mutual promises of lifelong devotion, spiritual or otherwise. Among the laity, close companions of the same sex might adopt similar practices, exchanging vows of fidelity and support. The language of such vows often drew on the forms of legal contracts or spiritual covenants repurposed to articulate forbidden bonds. Of course, secrecy was essential. Such unions could not be celebrated openly. To do so risked ruin. Instead, they unfolded in the quiet margins of medieval life, in whispered promises, in letters written in cautious code, in keepsakes hidden beneath garments or within prayer books. Occasionally, fragments of such relationships surface in the historical record. A letter, a disputed inheritance, a cryptic entry in a court case. But for the most part, these unions remain invisible, their traces effaced by time and silence. Even within more conventional relationships, informal vows and private rituals played a role. A couple separated by distance, a merchant and his wife, a soldier and his beloved, might exchange private promises to sustain their bond. Such vows, while not legally binding, carried great personal weight. They were recorded in letters, reinforced through tokens, and honored through acts of fidelity across months or years of separation. In a world where mortality loomed large and absence was often prolonged, such private rituals helped sustain fragile connections. At the heart of all these secret unions lay a simple truth: the human need for connection could not be wholly contained by law or doctrine, whether through clandestine marriage, cohabitation, same-sex vows, or informal promises. People sought ways to affirm their bonds, to make love visible, however briefly, in a world that often sought to erase it. The risks were real. Discovery could mean shame, punishment, or separation. Yet the persistence of such unions across classes, across centuries, speaks to the quiet resilience of love. Still, not all medieval couples succeeded in keeping their secrets. When forbidden love was exposed, whether through betrayal, gossip, or sheer mischance, the consequences were swift and often public. Communities responded with a repertoire of punishments designed to shame, deter, and restore the moral order. For medieval Europeans, the ideal of a chaste and orderly society was not simply a private matter. It was a public concern, woven into the very fabric of communal life. When someone, or some couple, transgressed the boundaries of sexual morality, the response was not merely personal correction, nor a discreet word from the local priest. It was public, and not accidentally so. The exposure and punishment of sexual sin served an important communal function. It reminded everyone in no uncertain terms of what was expected and of what might happen if one strayed too far from the accepted path. Public shame was an ancient and well-honed tool. In an age before mass media, its theater unfolded in village squares, at church doors, and along bustling market streets. Word spread quickly. A whispered accusation might travel from hearth to hearth, gathering force until it reached the ears of the priest or magistrate. If the charge was deemed serious, say adultery, fornication, or clandestine marriage, the next step was not merely a stern talking to in a private chamber. It was a ritual of exposure. The community itself became part of the process, called upon to witness and to remember. Let us begin with the most basic form, public confession. A sinner convicted or having confessed would be ordered to stand at the church door during Mass barefoot, clad in a plain shift or rough tunic. Sometimes a placard would be hung around the neck, bearing words such as adulterer or fornicator. The condemned stood in full view of neighbors, family members, and passing strangers alike. They were to express visible contrition, bowed head, folded hands, downcast eyes. Whether true repentance always accompanied these displays is difficult to say, but the performance of shame was required and meticulously observed. For more serious offenses, processions were employed. A woman caught in adultery might be paraded through the streets, escorted by constables or church officials, jeered at by onlookers. Her hair might be unbound, a powerful symbol of disgrace, and she might be made to carry a symbolic object, a distaff for a wayward wife, a bundle of birch rods for a repentant fornicator. Men, too, faced such treatment. A convicted seducer might be marched through town with a rope around his neck, or forced to wear a hood with donkey ears, a not-so-subtle commentary on his perceived foolishness. The goal of these rituals was twofold. First, to restore the moral order by making the sinner acknowledge their fault before the community. Second, and perhaps more importantly, to deter others from similar behavior. By making the punishment memorable, the authorities hoped to impress upon the minds of all present the dangers of moral lapse. One need only imagine the long shadow such a procession would cast in a small village where reputations were fragile and memories long. But not all punishments were physical. Economic penalties were common. A fine might be imposed payable to the church, the Lord, or the municipal authority. Sometimes the fine was graduated higher for repeat offenders, lower for first-time transgressors. In regions where money was scarce, other penalties were devised. Temporary loss of market rights, exclusion from guild activities, or perhaps, worst of all, the withdrawal of communal support during illness or hardship. Such punishments were not always written in formal codes, but they were keenly felt. Shunning was another powerful weapon. While not officially codified in most legal systems, the practice of social ostracism could be devastating. Neighbors might refuse to greet or serve the condemned. Friends and family might withdraw their support. In extreme cases, the entire community might be instructed by priest or town crier to avoid all contact until the offender completed their penance. This form of punishment was particularly effective in the close-knit world of medieval villages and towns where isolation could threaten one's livelihood and well-being. The church, too, wielded spiritual penalties. A person convicted of sexual sin might be barred from receiving the sacraments, a grave sanction in an age when spiritual health was seen as vital to salvation. Reconciliation required a formal process of penance, confession, and public contrition. Until this process was complete, the offender remained under a cloud of spiritual and social suspicion. And yet, for all the severity of these punishments, they were not always universally supported. In some cases, communities quietly resisted the harshest forms of exposure. Friends might stand by a disgraced neighbor. Relatives might shield a young couple from the full force of public shame. Even some priests, weary of endless cycles of sin and penance, might counsel a more compassionate approach, particularly in cases of genuine affection or hardship. It must also be said that over time the appetite for public exposure waned in certain regions. By the later Middle Ages, some towns began to replace processions and shaming with private penance and monetary fines. This shift reflected changing attitudes toward personal privacy and perhaps a growing recognition of the human costs of such spectacles. Still, in many places, the old rituals persisted well into the early modern period. The theater of shame remained a potent means of enforcing moral conformity. And so, from the candle-lit confines of the marriage bed to the echoing emptiness of public shunning, medieval sexual life unfolded within a web of surveillance expectation and carefully choreographed punishment. Yet, amid all this, amid the sermons and confessions, the whispered warnings and ritualized exposures, love in all its varied forms continued to find a way. It leapt the boundaries of class and law. It shaped secret unions and fleeting trysts. It whispered through convent walls and monastery cloisters. And it endured not because it was permitted, but because it was irrepressibly human. And now, gentle reader, as our long meandering journey through medieval intimacy, draws to its close. You may find yourself like a weary traveler returning from the marketplace, ready to rest. You have wandered through crowded peasant homes, through stone-walled abbeys, through noble chambers, guarded by ceremony and surveillance. You have peered behind the curtains of marriage and glimpsed the hidden places where forbidden love dared to bloom. And perhaps, amid all the rules and rituals, you have seen something simple and enduring, that even in the most constrained of worlds, the human heart persists. Now the hour grows late. The candles sputter low. Close your eyes if you wish. The past will keep its stories for another night. And in dreams, perhaps you might wander a quieter medieval lane, one where no watchers stand and no proclamations disturb the peace. Sleep well.